work for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. I'm really excited for today's interview. We have a guest with us who had a big impact on me as a young organizer, somebody that was interested in media and culture, provided some trainings to me and a bunch of other young organizers that I think set us on a really good path and helped sharpen my frame. And I'm really excited to share that with our listeners today and get into how this media justice frame connects to our critique of capitalist real estate. So I want to say welcome to Steven Renderos. Thanks for joining us, bro.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Jake.
Hell yeah. Can you start by introducing yourself to our listeners, a little bit about who you are and your work? And then if you could talk about media justice, and I'm thinking both if you want to talk about the organization that you work for, Media Justice, and then more generally, what is a media justice framework? Like what kind of issues and struggles pertain to media justice?
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm Steven Renderos. I'm from Los Angeles originally, but actually spent over a decade in the Twin Cities. I went to school out there, but also came of age in terms of my own organizing, started organizing straight out of college, doing organizing with a tenants union that represented residents of manufactured home parks, but also got involved in like the art scene. I was, DJ'd with my friend Miguel for many years, started a radio show at a local community radio station, KFAI.
Shout out Radio Pocho. They actually had us on to talk about the podcast and still like something I tune into. So that's a great legacy that you started.
Yeah, I mean, they're going on 10 plus years at this point. And, I was around for, I think, the first 3 years of it, which is cool. But to see something have legs even beyond, my own contributions, I think is exciting. And that's the kind of legacy I think any of us can hope for, right? And yeah, I mean, I came of age as an organizer in the Twin Cities, organized on a couple of different issues from affordable housing to immigrant rights to some like police violence stuff. But my passion was always kind of thinking about culture. I was always interested in like the role that culture can play in shaping conditions for social change. And for me, I think one of my entry points to that early on as a kid, growing up in an immigrant household with family from El Salvador, in a California that was very anti-immigrant at that time, was watching the way that media portrayed immigrants, which was like not my own lived experience. It was the illegal immigrant, story, the blight on society, the ones that are bringing in diseases. Even back then, there's like political ads from Governor Pete Wilson, who was super anti-immigrant, who has these videos of scourges of immigrants coming across the border, which like should feel fairly familiar. It's the same story we hear repeated over and over. But I would see those kinds of media representations, and I would always think like that's not the reality. That's not my experience. And so I always had this idea of wanting to, better shape my own representations, tell my own story, which got me like super involved in trying to create my own media. So that's where like doing Radio Pocho, came from, like that desire to kind of reclaim our own story through music. And I was also interested in applying that kind of lens into community organizing. How could we use that in social movements that are working for change? And that's when I came across this organization called the Center for Media Justice, which was founded by a good friend of mine, Malkia Cyril, which, to this day, we organize for the digital rights of people of color here in the US. We believe that the right to communicate is a fundamental human right and everyone should have access to it, meaning that every kind of means of communication, be it the internet, radio, TV, should be much more widely accessible to people, because the more that we can decentralize access to those things, the more that more voices and more people can be heard from, and we can shape different outcomes for our society. And really that analysis comes from a place of, it's rooted in the human rights framework, but also comes from this idea of cultural hegemony, which was popularized by Antonio Gramsci, who was a Marxist, who knew that there were institutions in society that shaped culture, shaped our kind of ideological common sense. And that's everything from, schools, government, religion, media, and he lived under kind of the fascist regime in Italy with Mussolini. And in that society, in a very fascist society, that they were dealing with that to the extreme. I mean, media was controlled, religious discourse was controlled, everything was hyper controlled. And, we live in a society that's actually not too different from that.
Right.
It's just that who gets to actually control and own the stories is corporations instead of like one singular figure at the very top.
Right.
But the same is true today. And what it leads to is institutions that are representative of very particular interests. And so who owns the media, who gets to shape the curriculum in schools, as we see in the fight for critical race theory, who gets to shape what religion is the norm in our society, really dictates who belongs and who doesn't belong. And it has other consequences. It leads to what we're seeing and which schools get invested in and which don't. Which religions are taken seriously and which don't, which sets of people are surveilled and are the focus of investigations by law enforcement and which are not.
Right.
So from that place, I think we understood that our ability in social movements to have greater control and access and shape our media and technology today, create the conditions for movements to succeed. So over the last 10, 15 years, that's been our work at the national level. So the struggles can range anything from greater access to internet, which has been a big focus of our work in the last year, especially during a pandemic, to fighting back the use of technology in the context of policing or in prisons, through surveillance tech or through the use of electronic monitoring. So that's a little bit about our work.
Hell yeah. That's awesome. One thing that jogged my memory just to think about, to give people kind of a tangible example, I remember I was in my early 20s when we got acquainted with one another, and you did a training that really broke down the effects of media and the ownership by looking at the Iraq War, and that was and I'm thinking about that with, the withdrawal from Afghanistan being on everybody's mind this week. And I remember you showed us, this image of the statue of Saddam Hussein being toppled. And this was something that was broadcast into all of our homes, me as a teenager. And it was portrayed as if it was this glorious uprising of the spontaneous people of Iraq pulling down this dictator statue. So you showed us those pictures and kind of had us reflect on them. And then you showed us a zoomed out picture. And what we saw was that was a complete PR stunt by the American military, that there was tanks surrounding the square, that it was a photo op designed specifically to create the impression that we were being welcome as liberators, when that was not at all the case. And it was an intentional act of psychological warfare. And then when you connect that to the fact that it's some of the companies that have profited most handsomely from the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan own and are connected to some of the biggest media channels, if you look at CNN and NBC and General Electric. So that always had an impression on me, and that was a training that I would go on and share with young people, so that I just wanted to really salute you for that, and just kind of make concrete some of these issues for listeners.
Yeah, I mean, in Afghanistan, the same thing is playing out. I mean, we've been in perpetual war in Afghanistan for 20 years now, and the question that keeps coming up in the current coverage is, how could the Taliban take over so quickly, right? How could this happen? And the answer lies in people not telling the truth. It's not like the military, the US military didn't know that the Afghan military was unprepared. And it's not like they didn't know that the Afghan government was had faults in their ability to govern the country and would likely fold. It's just that they didn't tell the public about it, because if you tell the public about it, and this is a lesson that the US military learned after Vietnam, greater news transparency is actually not good for war, because what it does is, accurate coverage of war, to the extent that it was during Vietnam, fomented a lot of anti-war sentiment on the home front. And so since that time, the military has actually been very deliberate about its relationship to media. And we actually cover this on the podcast that I work on, Bring Receipts. in an episode we did on Rambo, there was a shift in the 1980s where the military was not just like trying to curate the image of the military, but very much like feeding actual stories. And that's why what's that movie with Tom Cruise? I keep forgetting. It's like the Air Force movie.
Top
That
Gun.
was like Top Gun. That was one of the very first like major collaborations where like the Air Force was like super like check out our equipment. We're going to use our logos. Like prior to that, you didn't really see that. But since that time, they've been very deliberate, and I think they've in war reporting in Afghanistan, they were very deliberate about which units that they could travel with, who they could speak to, who journalists could talk to, all with an eye towards like protecting the overall integrity of the story, that things were going well. And so long as you could sell that story on the home front, you could continue justifying, millions, billions, trillions of dollars in spending.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to dig into a bit to like the specific issue that really brought you to mind for this podcast. We started this podcast as a critique of the Upper Harbor Terminal development. This is a 48-acre parcel of land on the North Side Riverfront, a former industrial port that has been seized upon by the largest real estate capitalists in the state, the Pollad family. These are white billionaires, some of the wealthiest people in the nation, who have got an exclusive rights agreement from the city to redevelop this plot of land in North Minneapolis. So I've been following it for many years, along with many other people, and challenging this development just off the simple equation that the wealthiest white people in the state should not be the ones profiting from a redevelopment in a neighborhood that's been redlined and oppressed and polluted. And also because I think it's a good window into a way that like the capitalist economy functions in general, to keep the poor poor and the wealthy wealthy. And one of the connections I wanted to make was that the Pollads have diversified into media. They owned Go 96. They just sold it. So even to think about that as far as like what it means for the wealthiest white capitalists to own the predominant hip hop station in the city, that was one issue. But another issue is that another real estate development that they just finished is they developed a venue in downtown Minneapolis called the Filmore. So it's a copy of the Filmore in San Francisco, the original Filmore. And the collaborators that they worked with who co-own the venue is this company called Live Nation. And I'm a little bit familiar with Live Nation. I understand that they're one of the biggest kind of monopolies in the entertainment industry. And they came here with one of the biggest monopolies in real estate to do this project in downtown, this dual hotel and venue. And I thought this is a great opportunity for us to learn more about who's profiting now off of this cultural district downtown. We know that it's the white real estate magnates, but I wanted to learn more about who is Live Nation. So I'm wondering, do you know anything about Live Nation? Could you kind of talk to us about who they are and what is their role in our media ecosystem?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing when you start going into consolidation, you start finding that you go down different rabbit holes. Live Nation is its own beast in and of itself. They do control like a pretty significant chunk of, live entertainment across the country. They consolidated through live venues and concerts. They produce all of the live, a lot of live concerts. But they also own one of the largest ticket distributors, Ticketmaster. They merged with them back in 2010, which was like the site of a lot of like concern from people who saw the consolidation of these two mega companies coming together being really damaging towards towards music and entertainment. But it went through, and Live Nation itself is actually owned by a larger media conglomerate called Liberty Media, which also owns Pandora, iHeartMedia, going to like the collection of radio stations, which iHeartMedia used to be Clear Channel, which, in their late 90s, early 2000s was one of the biggest owners of radio stations across the country. At that stage, I think they owned like 1,500 radio stations. Today, I think they're more like 500 or 600. But they own that. Liberty Media also owns major stakes in Sirius XM. So, and all of that is owned by this one white dude, John C. Malone, who his claim to fame happens to be that he's also the largest like private landowner in the United States. So bringing it full circle, for the longest time, media has been seen as like a very credible cash cow business for, rich white elites. And you started to see a trend in this direction in the early 70s when Wall Street started digging into newspaper companies, which at that point were mostly family owned, but they were like affluent family owned. You had like the Gannett's, the Ox, who owned the New York Times, big, rich, old money. And a lot of those companies, which were previously like family owned businesses, were getting sold to corporations. And it's around that time that Wall Street got hip to the fact that like, hey, like here's a place where if we purchase this company, we can figure out a way to make a return on our investment of 20-30% annually, which is like, making margins that are huge. And that's like what kind of led to the wave of consolidation we started seeing into the 80s and 90s and, and into the early 2000s. So for the longest time, I think rich white people have always known like own media because that is a place where you can make a ton of money. And John C. Malone, like his main wealth came from cable. Like he was a big kind of cable magnate as well. So Live Nation, they are a venue production, concert production company. They also own the biggest like ticket sale company, Ticketmaster. In 2010, when they merged, there was a condition placed upon them by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission that dictated that they couldn't compel venues to use Ticketmaster. Like if you were Live Nation and you were producing a concert or a tour or something, you couldn't compel a venue in a local city to use your ticket distribution company. But of course, like they did it anyways. They kind of deboed people into using Ticketmaster no matter what. And just last year, were fined not a lot of money. I mean, there was just a slap on the wrist, basically, like you shouldn't have done that. But they probably will continue to engage in that practice. So it is problematic, like seeing this kind of partnership between the Filmore in Minneapolis and Live Nation. What it means is, for all the other kind of local venues that are locally owned, your ability to access the artists that you would want to come through your city on a tour is going to be limited and undercut by that, right?
Yeah.
So, it starts to affect the economy around entertainment and arts and music and all that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Something came to my mind right now, and this is kind of off the cuff, but from my memory, it felt like it was related. What was the Telecommunications Act of 1996? Is that related to this? Like, for some reason, when I think about these topics, that keeps coming to my mind. Could you break that down for us?
Yeah, and it actually goes a little bit further back. So go back to Ronald Reagan and his FCC during the 1980s, where that's when you start to see the first kind of real wave of media consolidation. And back then it was companies trying to justify further consolidation by saying, if you let us like buy up more companies, we can deliver a better service to people. That was the justification. And so you start to see early waves of it happening starting in the 1980s. And we went in the 1980s from about 50 kind of media companies that owned TV stations, radio stations, everything that we, watch and consume in media, to about 4 in a period of 20 years. And the Reagan and Reagan's FCC like did a lot to like start that trend. And then the 96 Telecom Act obviously passed under Bill Clinton, did a lot more. And one of the things that it adjusted was it changed rules that used to exist before then that would prevent, further media consolidation. Up until that point, if you were a newspaper, you could buy up more newspapers, but you were capped at a certain level. Like you couldn't own more than 30% of the newspapers in any given market. But after the 96 Telecom Act, all those things got loosened completely. And not just that, like now, if you were a newspaper company, you could own not just more newspapers, but you could also own TV stations and radio stations. And that's where you start to see, companies like Comcast, Xfinity, as they're known now, start to emerge where, prior to the 96 Telecom Act, they actually weren't allowed to own the cable channels that they were distributing to people. They were prevented from doing that because there was an idea that there was a conflict of interest.
Right.
And after the 96 Telecom Act, it only took a few years before they tried to merge with NBC Universal, which also owns Telemundo. And now they own a bunch of the TV channels that they actually deliver to people. And which presents all kinds of conflict of interest. Like they're going to promote the stuff that it's in their best interest. And that's where you start to see a lot of these like, TV blackout arguments that come up in regional levels around sports and around what content is available to people. You started to see similar consolidation happening with conservative media. There's a really conservative media company. Now I'm going to forget the name of it, but they own a bunch of TV stations, a bunch of newspapers, et cetera, all across the country.
I was thinking about that too. Does it start with a G?
I'm going to forget. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's all good. But I'm sure listeners, it'll probably ring a bell for them too. But it's this idea that there's one company that has a very conservative ideology that owns all these different stations in markets across the country. And it gets to this point, I want to stress for listeners, the danger in all this is, like you said, that idea of hegemony, that if you have a really small number of wealthy capitalist institutions controlling what you're able to hear, what you're able to see, what's put in front of the children, what's put in front of our families, it really has a distorting effect on our ability to even live in a democracy, to have access to information, to be able to be discerning about public policy, and to even know what's happening in the world. And also, I think on the richness of our culture, if the independent artists, if the independent producers aren't allowed to have a forum and they're boxed out by these large monopolies, it really, it becomes like agribusiness, monoculture. We're only seeing one dominant way of life, and it really robs us of a lot of like the cultural richness that we could experience.
That's right. I mean, and I think that's the problem with a company like Live Nation, which, I think what you see a lot more of today with consolidated companies is this kind of vertical integration, which is not unprecedented. We saw this in the robber baron era, where you had the robber barons that owned, not just like the trains, but the actual railroad tracks, and then the trucks that delivered stuff to people. Like they owned every like angle of the business. And that's what a lot of these companies are trying to do today. And like Live Nation, owning the venues, owning the ticket distributor, trying to cut out alternatives that have emerged as like in the resale market. And just to give folks a sense, like Ticketmaster controls 80% of the ticket distribution market, which is like insane. I mean, that is monopoly beyond monopoly.
Right.
And then on top of that, like being part of a media conglomerate that also owns Pandora, that also owns a bunch of radio stations, that also owns SiriusXM, all supposedly channels that offer alternative like means of content for people, all being owned under one umbrella means that like if you're an artist that's emerging, you have no choice but to participate in this game, because otherwise you're not going to have access to, the tours, the distribution of getting your music out, right, and even the channels that currently exist, like your SoundClouds and alternative platforms are getting choked out by the complete market concentration that exists here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really appreciate that breakdown. I know one thing I think will resonate with people, and when I was doing some studying and preparation, it's like, I'm sure most people listening to this have been stung by some Ticketmaster fees, and then you realize that if you want to go to the show, though, you got to eat that, and it just drives up the price for everybody. And I think that's an issue of class and race and access, because we're talking about now this Filmore development with the Pollads at the Upper Harbor Terminal. The center of the development that they're proposing is a collaboration with First Avenue, and it's an outdoor amphitheater music venue, and that raises questions as far as like, who's going to be able to go to that? And in this consumption economy, who is that really for, and what ripple effect is it going to have? So it's been like an interesting kind of a nuanced analysis, because, First Ave is the dominant player in our local market, and I've been very critical of their role in this development. I don't think a company that's owned by a white person who inherited millions should have this opportunity, even that centralization. But then when I'm talking to the owner of First Avenue, she's telling me, look, we're the small fish compared to Live Nation. And that's kind of true in a sense, but I think more so than that, leading me to have a lot of sympathy for First Avenue, it helps me understand like really how oppressed in the media environment like the local artists are and how far we have to go to break up some of these monopolies, you know?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and the thing is, like, I think if the, say, like the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission and to some extent in the media side, the Federal Communications Commission, if they looked at these mergers and say these mergers don't serve the public interest, they actually never accomplish the things that they say they're going to do, you know, and like this 2010 merger with Live Nation and Ticketmaster, where they said we're not going to force people to use Ticketmaster, but they did anyways. And you know, the consequences of forcing people to use Ticketmaster anyways is just a slap on the wrist. It was like a $3 million fine, which for them is nothing.
Right.
You know, but if you were to say, okay, this isn't going to serve the public interest, we're not going to allow these mergers to happen, and we actually reverse to go the other way, let's break some of these companies up, then you start creating more opportunities, more innovation, like more spaces for new voices to enter the fray. And I think that like, but because there's such a commitment to capitalism in its current configuration, that more is better, that bigger will deliver more for people, which is a principle that has consistently let us down year after year after year, because there's such a commitment to that at different levels of government, and you have people sitting in regulatory agencies who actually come from these industries, you know, so it's you can't govern yourself. It's never going to serve a public interest. So anyways, it's a frustration, but I definitely hear what you're saying. It's a choke point, and even companies like First Ave that do have a lot of cultural dominance in an area like Minneapolis are still beholden to even much bigger players.
Right. Hell yeah. So I wanted to shift a little bit, and this is all related, but to kind of talk about another media justice issue. Over the years, you know, I've watched you organize and agitate around net neutrality. And I wanted to know if you could kind of give us a breakdown of like what net neutrality is. And then I'm a little embarrassed to say that I'm not really even hip to like where that struggle is at right now. So could you talk to us about like what is that struggle over net neutrality and where do things stand today in terms of internet access and the politics of the internet?
Yeah, I mean, net neutrality is the overall principle that every voice online should be treated equally, meaning that like whether you're Jake doing MPLS podcast or you know, some podcast produced by Heart Media, that people should be able to access that content equally. There shouldn't be fast lanes. There shouldn't be slow lanes. You shouldn't have, you know, companies dictating what you can and can't see. I think that general principle of net neutrality has allowed for the kinds of like kind of decentralization of who gets to speak in our society in ways that are good. In the early days of the internet, I think we saw some like really good examples of this. You know, Arab Spring is a thing that comes to mind for me, where access to platforms like Twitter became this real kind of mechanism to tell a story and to really challenge power. And you know, and here in the U.S., I think like I experienced that a lot around Ferguson, where you know, there's nothing unique about the police killing of Mike Brown. You know, I think we had experienced police killings prior to that, you know, in Minneapolis. I think we'd had ample experience with that, like going back to Fong Lee being killed by the Minneapolis Police Department in North Minneapolis. Nothing unique about Mike Brown being killed. What was different was there was the access or the ability to communicate about what was happening. Because, you know, prior to that, after Mike Brown was killed, the media, mainstream media did what it typically does, which is one, either cover the story from the perspective of the police or completely ignore it. And, you know, people just would not let that happen here because you had access to, you know, to mechanisms to get your voice out. The same thing, I think, in the case of the killing of George Floyd last summer. Literally within minutes of George Floyd being killed, you know, the Minneapolis Police Department is releasing a press statement to try to frame the story and from their particular perspective. So these are tried and true tactics, but
they said he died of a medical incident.
Exactly. You know, and the thing that would force the narrative away from that was people who were actually there, people getting to tell their own story, people protesting and being able to see that very visibly. And I think that's the promise of the internet, is it gets to decentralize who are the traditional gatekeepers of information. And so that's a big reason why we fought for it. We've been fighting for it for well over a decade. Back in 2015, we were successful in getting the Federal Communications Commission to adopt some rules around net neutrality. They were really strong. It prevented, your internet service provider from blocking, from slowing down, from forcing you to pay more money to access certain content. And then in 2016, with the new administration, actually took a couple years, but by 2017, Trump's Federal Communication Commission reversed it, and threw us in this place where currently the internet is not protected by any real principles of net neutrality. And so there's likely bad behavior going on from internet service providers that we either don't know about or not being documented. That said, I think after the FCC under Trump repealed net neutrality, there were several states that passed like state laws to protect their users. And I was a part of an effort in California to get some really strong legislation in the books. With the current administration, there's a real shot to come back to it. And the implication isn't just like, can we get some net neutrality rules in place, but it's really about, how do we regulate the internet? Do we treat it as a commodity that only certain people should access, which is how, Trump's FCC and previous like FCCs in the past, like thought about the internet. There's a famous quote from a Republican FCC chairman, Michael Powell, who was Colin Powell's son, just to give you that context. But he had this statement about the internet and about the digital divide. He said, like, in the United States, there's also a Mercedes divide, meaning like I want a Mercedes, but I can't afford one. And that was his attitude towards the internet, that like, if you can't afford it, you shouldn't be on it. And I think some of that still resonates to this day. Yeah. But it's the net neutrality and like what that embodies is like, how should we regulate it? And I think one of the things that we're keen on and pushing for is for the Federal Communications Commission to regulate it more like a utility, where this is a basic need that people have, which opens the door for certain solutions that take us away from a kind of commodity type of business to one that's, that's a necessity for people, meaning that we should regulate prices. We should regulate the speeds and what speeds are guaranteed to people. And that hasn't been the case up until now, but I think there's a real appetite for that in large part because the pandemic, I think, really shifted people's understanding, both like everyday people, but also people in government, that like, this is a real critical thing. If we have to shut down as a society, people still need a way to work. People still need a way to, go to school. And the internet all of a sudden became like a real central hot topic of debate for a lot of people. And there's real appetite to do some really interesting things. So I'm excited for that.
That's dope. And it's like, I feel like another avenue for popular education, just think about political ideologies and capitalism versus something more socialist or communist, in terms of think about housing in the same way. If housing is considered a collective human right, then everybody is guaranteed access to it, and we fight for that. But in our society now, it's considered a commodity. Just like, if you look at it with that attitude of there's a Mercedes divide, there's a housing divide, and then the people who can't afford it, fuck them. They got to sleep outside in tents, as opposed to a non-capitalist society where we guarantee it as a public right and make sure everybody has it. The internet needs to be has that same war happening over it. Is it treated as something that people use for profit or a right? I don't know if it was you or somebody else use the metaphor of kind of comparing it to a road also. It's like, is the road privately owned and then only people who could pay the toll get to pass, or is it public and everybody gets free access to mobility?
That's right. And I think there's like, we're far from like a society in which like we guarantee basic needs for people. But I think there are examples of where real consciousness is shifting as a result of this pandemic. And I think I've been thinking about it in our work of like, if we simply step away from this pandemic, going back to what was true before and the norms that what was true before, then we've lost a real good opportunity.
Hell yeah.
In the past year, we fought for and won the inclusion of an emergency broadband benefit that was passed as part of one of the stimulus bills that would deliver people a $50 subsidy for internet access. So if you're unemployed because of the pandemic, if you are a recipient of a Pell Grant, if you receive SNAP, Medicaid, or are at that like 200% or below the poverty line, you're eligible for this program, and it subsidizes your access to the internet. And, you know, in some places, like $50 a month for internet access, like goes a long way in terms of like paying for, you know, good quality internet in your home. That's the kind of program that like prior to the pandemic would have never, that would have been dead on arrival. But like, because of the circumstances in this moment, there's real opportunity to move through. And now like we've moved it in the latest infrastructure bill. A lot of things wrong with that infrastructure bill, but a permanent version of this program is in that bill. Which like gets us to the place where at least we believe that like everyone should have access to the internet, whether or not you can afford it. And that just wasn't true even a year and a half ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Step in the right direction. I just got a few more questions for you. And one I wanted to ask is like, actually I'm going to do them in reverse order. So this one I wanted to ask you, like, if MediaJustice were present, you know, in the world that you're fighting for, what would the media ecosystem look like? Like, if you could remove all those barriers and we were able to design a media system that was just, what are like, can you describe that for us a little bit? What values would govern it and what could it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we talk about, and folks can find this on our website, mediajustice.org, in the About Us section. We talk about that vision. It's when, you know, media and technology rights are widely distributed, meaning that like if you have the ability to kind of control and shape your own story, you know, I think we fight for things that kind of become representations of that. Like, you know, one of the last things I did before I left the Twin Cities was start this local effort, Twin Cities Community Radio, which eventually applied for, you know, 2 licenses for low power FM, became 2 different radio stations. One on the south side, you know, KRSM, and one over in Frogtown in St. Paul. But widely and equally distributed. To me, that future doesn't involve Comcast. It doesn't involve, you know, Clear Channel or Live Nation or any of these kind of big media conglomerates. Instead, we have a different models that serve our community's needs that are not profit based. You know, we're trying to do this in the internet space, and some of this came out in the infrastructure bill of pushing for funding that could help fund, you know, cooperatively owned, nonprofit owned internet service providers that are not, you know, guided by the idea of like making money, that a return on their investment is not the thing they're thinking about. And that's, I think, the future we want to live in, where access to media and technology is much more closely connected to the people that are actually using it. And, you know, and we shift away from a future in which we deal with data in this extractive model. Because right now, the data economy is pretty much like a modern version of like, you know, imperialism, colonialism. It's very super extractive. You know, our data is basically the raw material that then gets commodified and generates wealth for other people. And we need a future in which like that's not the case, where we're not a society based on like, you know, my value being like the data that I generate for a company like Facebook, and instead that I have sovereignty over that data, that my data is mine, that people don't get to manipulate that and use that against me in the future, you know, which happens today where, you know, if I go to a gas station and I go inside to pay, there are algorithms that determine that because I did that, it's a higher likelihood that I smoke. And if I smoke, that means that I'm a higher risk when it comes to loans. So maybe a bank shouldn't lend to me. There are things like that in that future that I think we need to be doing away with, and where we actually know how the technology works that we use in our lives. I think that's been a big part of like our educational work as an institution over the last 10 years, is to help demystify for people the technology that's being used against us. How does it work? Who owns it? You know, who gets to control it, and what we can do to stop it. And I mean, it's probably not the most inspirational vision. It's still kind of based in doom and gloom, but like, but I do have this like strong feeling that we can get to a future in which like, you know, the media and technology that we use to shape the culture around us can actually be controlled by us, so that we can shape a different future.
Hell yeah, that's awesome, man. It's like I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about it, because I realize it's touched so many of the stories we've told. Like one episode we did was about Target, and Target introduced this network of cameras downtown that was used to really hyper police and exclude young Black people and young people of color from downtown Minneapolis. And they created this network in league with MPD. And it's exactly that issue, like you said, of demystifying the fact that even those cameras there, and follow the line as far as who's looking at them and who's using them in a predatory fashion. And, facial recognition technology is connected to that. So to take some time to be able to actually focus on the media and the technology is, like, I think really worthwhile for us, and I really appreciate it. Are there other, like, hot struggles right now in your world? You kind of touched on them, but are there any other things that we didn't touch on that are really, like, people should be paying attention to in terms of these media justice issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, disinformation is one that we've been steeped in for the last couple of years. Disinformation meaning like the kind of intentional distribution of false information with a political purpose. That's the kind of definition, which is slightly different than misinformation, which is just like, I'm a bonehead and I'm just going to share false information online. And disinformation is one I think that we've been focused on because it has a very particular impact in a very racialized way, and in ways that I think, like, we take for granted. You take the 2016 elections, there was a very specific disinformation campaign that was targeting Black voters in Detroit, pressuring them, or not pressuring, but like more so encouraging people to skip out on voting at the presidential level. So don't vote for president, and instead you can vote everywhere down the line, but just don't vote for president. And in Detroit, it was effective in getting, close to 40,000 people not to do that. So 40,000 people in Detroit didn't vote for president, but they voted everywhere else. The margin of victory in 2016 between Trump and Clinton was like somewhere around 10,000. So that hyper-specific disinformation campaign was very effective in swaying that particular state. And there's other examples of disinformation campaigns that have been targeted against people of color here in the US that don't necessarily tie just to the elections, but the impact is very much about suppressing their participation in society. And it's an issue that I think we've been very engaged in, mostly at the platform level. Like, what is the responsibility of companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and et cetera? And what's their responsibility in ensuring that bad information isn't making it on these platforms, because they have an impact. The fact that, we have vaccine hesitancy at the scales that we do among communities of color is very much a part of, like, COVID misinformation that's being allowed to just remain on the platforms. January 6th, the insurrection doesn't happen without Facebook, like, really helping, people who believe in Stop the Steal coming together in Facebook groups. Like, the growth of those Facebook groups, like, there's data that some researchers that we're connected to, like, studied. It was massive. I mean, you went from almost having no groups that were called Stop the Steal to, like, hundreds of groups, thousands of people connected to each other. And then you get, an insurrection, a few weeks later. So that's an issue I think that we've been keen on. Obviously, surveillance technology is another that we've been invested in particular, facial recognition, and looking at the companies that are helping to perpetuate the distribution of that technology. So we've been mostly focusing on Amazon, which we think is fucked up on multiple levels. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to curse, but whatever.
Oh, please do. Fuck Amazon.
Yeah. But they have a product called Recognition that they sell to law enforcement. We know that it's inaccurate when it comes to identifying people of color, particularly Black women. But even beyond that, even if you can make the technology perfect, you're layering this technology in an institution of policing that has perpetuated violence against people of color. And we think that's wrong. And we don't think that a company like Amazon should be participating in that. So we've been pushing a lot of pressure their way, and have been successful in getting them to stop selling that product to law enforcement, at least for the time being. So those are a couple of issues I think that we've been active on. I mean, the other one I think I mentioned briefly was electronic monitoring, placing people on electronic monitoring when they're being released from jail pre-trial, or when they're being released from prison, on probation or parole. we're seeing a growth in the use of electronic monitoring now, particularly as movements are pushing for, the end of cash bail, which is a racist system that keeps people incarcerated, as well as people pushing for the stopping the construction of jails. And our movements are being successful on those demands. It's actually pushing people to say, for elected officials to say, all right, cool, we won't build this jail, or we'll eliminate cash bail. But it's being replaced with an increased use of electronic monitoring, and the folks that we work with who are actually on monitors can tell you, like, it replicates the same kind of conditions of confinement. And the stories we hear from folks are heartbreaking. Like, if people can't respond to an emergency because if they step out their door, like one of our members did, whose mother was having a heart attack, like, you're bound to violate your conditions of being released and could be sent right back to prison.
Yeah.
So, that's an issue that we've been keen on to try to disrupt, because it's the next form of mass incarceration that we're seeing.
Right.
It's not an alternative to it. It's a form of incarceration.
That's a great issue to illuminate us with, because also we saw that same strategy being employed in the conversations around abolishing the police and the post-uprising here in Minneapolis. And we have to have literacy as a movement and as people to not allow like a new digital form of oppression to take the place of something physical, brick and mortar. So I appreciate that. I want to say one thing, and then I'm going to ask one more question, is I really think that your critique of the existing media structures is really important, because one thing that's really and important for us to be proactive about, because the one thing I think that was like really dangerous and effective that Trump did and the right wing did was really like appropriate a critique of the corporate media, So he says fake news, and that should resonate with you in America. It is fake news in a lot of ways, like they did sell the war in Iraq. They are spreading disinformation. And I don't mean even the right wing wingnut news. I mean CNN, I mean NBC, and and if you just come from a liberal position, then where you end up defending the corporate media, you're going to lose a lot of people who instinctually or through bits of information understand that our media system is broken. So I think like getting ahead of that type of critique and not allowing it to be co-opted by the right wing is really important. And I think the information that you're coming with in terms of like understanding ownership structures, understanding the impact of those ownership structures, it really gives us the ammo to do that and really come forward then with a progressive, justice-minded critique. Because I think that was really dangerous if we only allow the right wing to critique the status quo, because the status quo needs to be critiqued. So I just wanted to like lift you up again.
I mean, and a good example, one I would say is like, I think keep an eye on how the right is adapting. When you look across the country and you see the protests at PTA meetings around, mask mandates or debates around critical race theory, where white people are just up in arms, everywhere. Keep an eye on how they're engaging in those tactics. They're replicating movements. They're replicating organizing. They're learning from how we've engaged in the work, and they're replicating the demands, the rhetoric. We've been critiquing media for a really long time, and they're adapting that and utilizing that themselves, because it's, it creates a false sense of marginalization, and that feeds into the isolation that a lot of people in power are feeling. So I think one thing that's one thing to be concerned with, and it's always been the case that, these kind of structures, media has been utilized to really protect certain financial interests, and a very tangible example of this is Gannett Newspapers. That was one of the biggest like newspaper conglomerates in 60s, 70s, and 80s. Their biggest advertiser was the tobacco industry. They chose rarely to publish articles that were very critical of tobacco and its relationship to cancer, because that was their biggest cash cow. And, and there are financial interests that are tied into this. So I think that's always been the case. And if we look at the right and we understand like who's funding all this like work against, critical race theory, who's like behind a lot of the anti-mask stuff, it's a lot of the same like rich elites. It's not coming from like poor working class white folks. That's not where this movement is coming from. It's very much an elitist thing.
And I was thinking about that when you were talking about how disinformation is targeted specifically at people of color, and that's very true. And I have to like bring my own experience to the table. Being from a working class white family, really the type of people who are targeted with racist disinformation, specifically because we're oppressed by this system too, you know, and we have a lot of reason to make common cause with people of color and really develop a critical consciousness. So a part of me doing this podcast is out of my effort to reach out to my own community to like, because like you said, the racists and the elite understand the power of this type of media critique and this type of information warfare. And if the only people going to talk to young people like me are reactionaries and racists, that's not good. We have to beat them to the punch, you know, and really provide people with a more clear analysis. So I wanted to ask one last thing before we log off is in addition to your organizing work, you're still producing and creating and doing the media work. So I tuned into your podcast and I really enjoyed listening to it. So could you just kind of tell people about Bring Receipts? What's the concept of the show and where can they tune in?
Yeah, I mean, it's Bring Receipts is a podcast I produce with my friend Brandy Collins Dexter, who's a friend of mine who I've known for a really long time. We actually worked together at MediaJustice way back when I first started here, back in like 2012. But the concept of the podcast is we debate, you know, unpopular takes around pop culture, and emphasis on unpopular because they're pretty bad takes for the most part, but we use the podcast to really debate each other on some of these questions of conversations that we'd probably be arguing with each other around, and instead we just record it. But beyond that, honestly, it's for me, it's been an opportunity to get to hang out with a good friend of mine. And that's why I'm doing it mostly. It gives me an excuse to hang out with a friend on a weekly basis and just produce content. But we wrapped up season one. Season one was focused on the 1980s. So every episode focuses on something different. Like the first one, which is probably the hottest take that we had all season, was like the movie Soul Man being a really progressive film, which is a movie about a white dude who's dressed up in blackface for pretty much the entire movie so that he could get a scholarship to go to Harvard Law. But that's not my take. That was my friend's take, Brandy. So y'all can listen and find out if you agree with her on that take. But season one was 1980s. Season two, we're in the works now. We'll probably release that sometime in the next month.
Cool. That's awesome. Well, I want to say thank you for joining us. I really learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners really learned a lot, and sending a lot of love to you and to MediaJustice and to the family. You were tuned in with Steven Renderos from MediaJustice. And you know what I'm saying? Keep up the good work. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity.